If I asked you about your morals, how would you answer? Maybe with never tell a lie or the golden rule, treat others the way you want to be treated. Whatever your morals are, we can agree that as a society, we use morals to keep each other in check and prevent terrible actions. But could our morals actually be harming us? Think about how strict adherence to certain moral codes can sometimes backfire. For example, the moral rule to always be honest can clash with the need to protect someone's feelings, potentially causing unnecessary pain. Societal norms based on moral beliefs can sometimes perpetuate injustices. History shows many instances where moral convictions were used to justify wrongdoings like slavery and segregation. Even today, strict moral stances can sometimes block progress and inclusivity. When morals become too rigid, they can prevent critical thinking and empathy, leading to judgment and division rather than understanding and unity. So while morals are crucial for keeping order and promoting good behavior, it's important to re-examine and adapt them regularly. Being flexible with our morals can help create a more inclusive and compassionate society, focusing on the well-being and dignity of everyone. This approach ensures that our ethical framework evolves as we learn more about humanity and justice. Nietzsche thinks so. His thought process is that the moralization of our lives has insidiously attached itself to genuine psychological needs, some basic to our condition, others cultivated by the conditions of life under morality. So its corrosive effects cannot simply be removed without further psychological damage. The concept of good and evil has been a subject of philosophical inquiry for centuries, with different philosophical traditions offering varying definitions and perspectives on what constitutes good and evil behavior, as well as the causes and consequences of such behavior. Good and evil are often used to describe moral or ethical behavior, with good typically referring to actions that are deemed to be morally right, such as helping others, telling the truth, and avoiding harm, while evil refers to actions that are deemed to be morally wrong, such as lying, cheating, or causing harm. In some religious traditions, good and evil are considered to be objective and absolute, determined by a divine being or by a set of moral laws that are inherent to the universe. In these traditions, good and evil are often seen as opposing forces, with good representing the forces of light and life, and evil representing the forces of darkness and death. In other philosophical traditions, however, good and evil are seen as more subjective and relative, dependent on cultural and historical factors, individual experiences, and personal perspectives. In these traditions, the concept of good and evil is often seen as less absolute and more as a matter of interpretation and moral judgment. Regardless of the perspective, the concept of good and evil continues to be a central topic of philosophical inquiry, with ongoing debates about the nature of morality, the sources of ethical behavior, and the impact of good and evil on our lives and our world. The philosophical debate on the concept of good and evil centers around several key questions such as objectivity versus subjectivity. Is good and evil an objective reality, determined by a divine being or by moral laws? Or is it a subjective interpretation, dependent on cultural and historical factors, individual experiences, and personal perspectives? This question lies at the heart of many philosophical, theological, and ethical debates. On one hand, those who argue for an objective basis for morality often cite religious doctrines, natural law, or universal principles that transcend human variability. They maintain that certain actions are inherently right or wrong regardless of context. On the other hand, proponents of moral subjectivity emphasize the fluidity and diversity of human experience. They argue that what is considered good or evil can vary widely across different societies and eras. This perspective suggests that moral judgments are influenced by a myriad of factors, including cultural norms, social structures, personal upbringing, and situational nuances. The subjective view posits that morality is a human construct, evolving with our collective and individual understanding of the world. Ultimately, the tension between objectivity and subjectivity in moral discourse challenges us to consider whether there can be a definitive standard for right and wrong, or whether morality is an ever-changing tapestry woven from the threads of human existence. Then there is absoluteness versus relativity. Are good and evil absolute and unchanging, or are they relative and dependent on context and causes of good and evil? What causes individuals to behave in morally good or evil ways? Are people inherently good or evil, or are their actions shaped by their environment, upbringing, and other external factors? How about consequences of good and evil? What are the consequences of good and evil behavior? Does good behavior lead to positive outcomes while evil behavior leads to negative outcomes? And the last one, the role of reason. How important is reason in determining good and evil behavior? Is morality a matter of rational calculation, or is it based on intuition, emotion, and other non-rational factors? These questions have been the subject of ongoing debate among philosophers, with different philosophical traditions offering varying answers and perspectives on what constitutes good and evil, and how we should understand and respond to these concepts in our lives. Despite the differences, however, the philosophical debate on good and evil remains a critical component of our understanding of morality, ethics, and the nature of the human experience. What about religious perspectives? In Christianity, good and evil are considered to be absolute and objective, determined by the will of God. According to Christian doctrine, God is the source of all that is good, and evil is the result of humanity's rebellion against God's will. In this tradition, good is associated with obedience to God, love, and righteousness, while evil is associated with sin, wickedness, and unrighteousness. In Hinduism, good and evil are seen as two sides of the same coin, each playing an important role in the cycle of birth and death and the ultimate goal of liberation from the cycle. According to Hindu philosophy, good actions lead to positive consequences, while evil actions lead to negative consequences, with the ultimate goal of balancing the forces of good and evil to achieve liberation. In Buddhism, good and evil are seen as being dependent on one's actions rather than being absolute and objective realities. According to Buddhist teaching, good actions lead to positive outcomes, while evil actions lead to negative outcomes, and the ultimate goal is to transcend the cycle of birth and death by following the Eightfold Path. But what about the philosophical perspectives like Aristotle's concept of the mean? Aristotle believed that good and evil were relative concepts, and that the key to ethical behavior was finding the mean between two extremes. For example, Aristotle believed that the virtue of courage was a mean between the extremes of cowardice and recklessness, or Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. Immanuel Kant believed that morality was a matter of rational calculation, and that the key to determining good and evil behavior was the categorical imperative, which stated that one should act only on principles that one could will to become universal laws. According to Kant, good actions were those that were in accordance with the categorical imperative, while evil actions were those that were in violation of it. What about modern views on good and evil? Existentialism and the absurd. Existentialists argue that good and evil are not absolute objective realities, but rather subjective interpretations dependent on the individual. In this view, good and evil are seen as having no inherent meaning, and individuals must create their own meaning in a world that is often considered absurd or meaningless. The ethics of care argue that good and evil are determined by the relationships between individuals and the obligations and responsibilities that exist within those relationships. This view emphasizes the concept of relative good and evil, moral relativism and subjectivity. The concept of relative good and evil refers to the idea that there is no absolute, objective standard for what is considered good or evil, and that these concepts are dependent on the individual's perspective and cultural background. In this view, what is considered good or evil is seen as relative and subjective, and there can be different, competing interpretations of what is considered moral or immoral in different contexts. Critiques of moral relativism. Moral relativism has been criticized by some philosophers and religious leaders for suggesting that there are no absolute moral standards or objective criteria for what is considered good or evil. Critics argue that moral relativism leads to moral nihilism and a lack of accountability, as it allows individuals to justify harmful or immoral behavior based on their own subjective beliefs or cultural background. Critics also argue that moral relativism leads to a lack of moral guidance and a lack of social cohesion, as it fails to provide a shared moral framework for society. The concept of good and evil has been a subject of philosophical and religious debate for centuries, with different perspectives and interpretations emerging over time. Traditional views on good and evil include religious perspectives, philosophical perspectives such as Aristotle's concept of the mean and Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, and modern views such as existentialism, ethics of care, and utilitarianism. Cultural and historical factors play a significant role in shaping people's perceptions of good and evil, and the concept of relative good and evil suggests that these concepts are dependent on the individual's perspective and cultural background. Implications for understanding good and evil in our lives. Understanding the concept of good and evil is important for guiding moral and ethical decision-making and behavior. By recognizing the subjective and culturally relative nature of these concepts, individuals can reflect on their own moral beliefs and values and engage in meaningful discussions with others to build a shared moral framework. This can help foster a sense of responsibility, accountability, and social cohesion, and contribute to a more just and equitable society. Philosophers have had a long-standing interest in the concepts of good and evil and have offered a wide range of perspectives and interpretations. Traditional philosophical views on good and evil include Aristotle's concept of the mean, which suggests that virtue lies in finding a balance between excess and deficiency, and Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, which argues that moral actions should be based on universal, absolute moral principles. Modern philosophical views include existentialism, which argues that the meaning of life is a personal and subjective choice, and that the concepts of good and evil are therefore relative to the individual. Ethics of care and the social contract approach suggest that good and evil are based on the responsibilities and obligations that individuals have to one another. Utilitarianism and consequentialism argue that the morality of an action should be based on its outcomes and consequences. Other philosophical perspectives, such as cultural relativism, suggest that what is considered good or evil is dependent on cultural norms and values and can change over time. Overall, philosophers have offered a diverse range of views on the concepts of good and evil, with no clear consensus on what constitutes these concepts or how they should be understood. The answer to the question of what is good and what is evil is complex and multifaceted, and has been a subject of philosophical and religious debate for centuries. There is no single, definitive answer, as opinions on what constitutes good and evil can vary greatly depending on individual beliefs, cultural norms, and historical context. Ultimately, the distinction between good and evil is a complex and deeply personal issue, and there is no single answer that can apply to everyone. Each individual must consider their own beliefs and values when forming opinions on what is good and what is evil. Good and evil are not abstract concepts, but are intertwined with the complexities of human nature and the context in which they are perceived.